Buenas tardes tengan todos ustedes. Me da muchísimo gusto tenerlos aquí presentes y tener la oportunidad de presentar esta serie de conferencias para conmemorar el aniversario de la publicación del origen de las especies, que ocurrió el 24 de noviembre de 1859. Son 4 conferencias de especialistas en estos temas. El día de ayer tuvimos al profesor Kapil Raj hablándonos de las revoluciones científicas, y el día de hoy nos da muchísimo, pero muchísimo gusto tener como invitada a la doctora Janet Browne, que ella está en el Departamento de Historia de las Ciencias de la Universidad de Harvard. Les pedimos una disculpa porque dice Janet Browne y dice Escuela de Altos Estudios, pero es de la Universidad de Harvard. Voy a permitirme, ella, bueno, va a hablar de Darwin como escritor, pero antes de dar la palabra me gustaría mencionar que la doctora Browne abarca la historia de las ciencias de la vida y de la tierra y sobre todo de la historia natural. En el 2006 impartió en Harvard diversos cursos sobre historia evolutiva, historia de la historia natural. Posterior a licenciarse en zoología, estudió un doctorado en historia de la ciencia. Ha dedicado muchos años de su carrera académica a estudiar el contexto de la obra de Charles Darwin, primero como editora asociada de los prístinos volúmenes de la correspondencia de Charles Darwin, y luego en una biografía de Darwin que integraba su ciencia con su vida y su época. Una de las principales intenciones del libro era explorar las formas de creación, distribución y aceptación del conocimiento científico, pasando de lo privado a lo público, como se refleja en la estructura de los 2 volúmenes de la obra. En la actualidad estudia el impacto de Darwin en la cultura popular desde su muerte hasta nuestros tiempos. Trabajó muchos años en el Centro Wellcome Trust de Historia de la Medicina de University College en Londres, donde impartió clases en los programas de maestría y licenciatura en Historia de la Ciencia, la Biología y la Medicina. Ha sido presidenta tanto de la Sociedad Británica de Historia de la Ciencia como de la Sociedad de Historia de la Ciencia, siendo la primera mujer en haberlo logrado. Tiene varios títulos honoríficos, pero entre ellos de su alma mater, del Trinity College, otorgado en el 2009. Janet, with this introduction, you have the floor. And thank you and very welcome.
Thank you very much. And I have just now to make my screen share, but I first wish to say what a pleasure it is to be with part of you today, to participate in this series of lectures commemorating Darwin's Origin of Species. I first wish to thank Professor Anna Barona for inviting me and to recognize online, since we have an audience here, how much she does, her international role in the history of science and medicine. She's very well known for her work in the history of biology, and I want to take this moment to say how much I value our meetings and other opportunities for interaction. So thank you, Anna, for the invitation, and I apologize much in advance now for not being able to speak to you in Spanish. I'm so sorry. So I want to take these lectures to explore, or certainly to refer to the new turn in the history of science, a turn towards deconstructing the great books and the great figures of the past. Let's see how I can share this. Share. There we go. Here am I on your screen, or at least here is my title. I'm going to talk about Charles Darwin as a writer, but first I wanted to talk a little bit about deconstructing the great books and great figures of the past, and how this deconstruction offers a fresh history that includes social and geopolitical factors that have mostly previously been ignored. So the lecturers in this series are each proposing a revised account of the origin of species and its impact. We're reevaluating the text of the origin and the concept of a revolution being brought about by this book. So we're thinking about Darwin as a figure embedded in his time. He was obviously subject to the influence of his travels during a time of 19th century colonial expansion. He participated in the publishing conventions of his day, and his ideas emerged within a long-established tradition of intellectually progressive thought. So he constructed his theory with the assistance of numerous correspondents, whilst he was also part of a financially secure, prosperous, and domestic setting. So I think this form of deconstruction, which many of us are engaging in, brings insight into the way that modern biological science took shape under the influence of industrialization and colonization and imperialism. So the old Darwin is really not the new Darwin. Times have changed, and a great deal of scholarly research over the last few decades has established that Darwin was not the only significant evolutionary thinker in the past, and that the intellectual and social movement called the Darwinian Revolution was not a revolution in the usual sense. You've had Professor Raj talking about that yesterday, and it was hardly due to Darwin alone. The evolutionary movement was much broader based than previously assumed, and several simultaneous lines of thought and political trends combined to create the conditions in which evolutionary ideas of many kinds could flourish. So Darwin's ideas emerged within a very diverse body of thought. However, and this is why we're gathered here today, hardly any other scientific book has so changed our conception of ourselves and the history of living beings more than The Origin, or as Darwin called it, On the Origin of Species. Published in London on the 24th of November, 1859, which was 183 years ago. It caused a substantial phenomenon as it, oh dear, I'm going to full screen, yes, and then I can move on. It caused a substantial stir when it was published on that day, and the print runs sold out in that very first day, and of course, as we know, it went on to become an international phenomenon through translation. Here we have it, the book and the first page. What we also have, using the Darwin archive at Cambridge University Library in the UK, is Darwin's diary, of course, covering many more years than this one, 1859. And you can see that right down at the bottom of this page for 1859, he says that the first edition was published on November the 24th, and all copies, i.e. 1,250, sold first day. So it was a print run of 1,250 and was sold out to the booksellers on that first day. The sensation was that the idea that living things gradually evolve through natural selection, which profoundly shocked, as we all know, its 19th century readers, calling into question the idea that organisms had been created by a divine force. And over the decades, Darwin produced a number of editions. Here we have the 6 editions of the volume, and his proposals were mostly accepted with modifications in the first 50 years after publication, and then in the 20th century, more fully integrated with the new field of genetics in order, or at least when it was integrated with the new field of genetics, it became the foundation of modern biology. So it has a very long and substantial existence in biological thought. People still read it today. Darwin called this book One Long Argument. And what an argument it was. Very few scientific books are so closely woven and packed with information and studied with richly inventive metaphor. And what I'm hoping to talk about today was Darwin's literary technique, because it has long been noted for Darwin's ability to handle many continuous threads at the same time, and has even been compared to some of the Victorian novels, other Victorian texts, such as Charles Dickens's novels or George Eliot's Middlemarch, in the complexity of interlacing themes. And among many other things, Darwin introduced in this book one of the most compelling metaphors of biology. He characterized the history of living beings as a tree, describing extinct ancestral forms as if they were the roots and the trunk, and each main group of organisms as the branches, and the current organisms he talked about as the green leaves at the end of the branches. It's a very powerful metaphor and has a long prehistory, but Darwin gave it its strength as a metaphor standing for evolution. And he speaks of it in these words: the great tree of life, which fills with its dead and broken branches the crust of the earth and covers the surface with its ever-branching and beautiful ramifications. So this spreading tree linked all the past and present organisms into an indivisible unit spanning the centuries. So it's time and today together. And his ability to visualize life in this way is actually now virtually synonymous with understanding it. So today, I want specially to draw your attention to Darwin's style. And as you know, he wrote in the first person, almost in a conversational way, speaking directly to the reader to describe his theory and the evidence he had uncovered, even including all the difficulties he had encountered. Although, as I'm sure you're aware, the two major difficulties that readers encountered when they were engaged with his book, the question of the existence of God and the question of the evolution of humankind out of ape ancestors, those two big questions, two big difficulties, were not actually in Darwin's book. He deliberately took those out, but he included a chapter of biological difficulties or other difficulties that he had encountered and addressed for his readers to understand that he too had initially felt the proposal was not possible to support. And his text on the origin of species is crammed with material that he had gathered in order to convince the reader that it was possible to think about evolution by natural selection as a way of changing organisms, and that it was not quite as difficult as one might initially assume. Stylistically, he wrote as clearly and as simply as he could. And I'm sure you're familiar with the text sufficiently to know that he didn't include any scientific diagrams, as might happen today. And there's only one chart that depicts evolutionary processes in a relatively easy visual mode. There's no pictures of fossils, no pictures of pigeons. None of his evidence is pictorial, nor does it include any footnotes or citations, bibliographical citations, which we now know was a feature of the circumstances under which he composed the book. His words throughout have a very personal air. And he seemingly appeared in the book just as he appeared in life, as a reputable scientific gentleman, trustworthy, conscientious, friendly, a man who did not speak lightly of the momentous questions coming under his gaze, a champion of common sense, honest to his data, and scornful of mere conjecture. This courteous and conciliatory tone of voice, I think, created a distinctive rapport between the author and readers. And I'm suggesting today, that this style of writing was one of his greatest gifts, immensely appealing to readers. And it served him well in controversies to come, diffusing animosity and allowing even the harshest critics to acknowledge that he was sincere and that his investigations were meticulous. So even his harshest enemies, and there were several, acknowledged that he was coming to this material with the sincerity and meticulous investigative procedures of science. And while, of course, the actual concept of the theory of evolution by natural selection was the main point of debate after publication, I'm going to suggest that the writing style that I've just characterized should also be considered a feature of the book that established Darwin as an author with very strong scientific credentials, as well as a moral compass, both of which helped promote his argument. So, how did he acquire this distinctive style? I propose that he learned it from long experience as a correspondent. In particular, I believe that he learned to write in an engaging fashion when he was a young man on the Beagle voyage. So here is a picture of the Beagle, not actually contemporary with Darwin's voyage, but taken from the Beagle's third voyage after the one that Darwin was on, in Sydney Harbour in Australia, and rather beautifully painted by the captain of another ship called Owen Stanley. So I think, or I'm going to propose, that Darwin learnt to write on the Beagle voyage. We can, in fact, compare his semi-public, we can compare his writing style in letters with his writing style in his private notebooks, which were often complex and handling ideas that were difficult to express in words. But in letters, he was able to talk about his endeavors in a style that became increasingly personal and increasingly attractive. And I want to explore this suggestion in a little more detail today. So the focus on writing has several here is Darwin on the Beagle voyage, or just after the Beagle voyage, as it happens, a few years after he returned from the Beagle voyage. It's our only illustration, it's our only image of in those 8 or 9 years. And here is how he learned to record everything on the Beagle voyage. The focus on writing has several justifications. Of course, he wrote things down before he went on the voyage, and of course, he wrote things down after the voyage. But the voyage itself was an operation, an endeavor, in which recording was a major part of all of the activities, not just Darwin's, but of the captains, of the surveyors. Everybody was writing home, everybody was recording what they were seeing, and there was expected to be a mountain of paper, charts, and other kinds of records that accompanied the ship on its way back to the United Kingdom. So we know Darwin wrote things down. Here are some of the ways he recorded his observations. There were catalogues of the species or the organisms that he collected, major catalogues for each form of organism, plants in one, geology in another, animals in another. Here are the notebooks that he used on board the Beagle. These are not the ones that are famous as the notebooks. These are the little leather-bound field notebooks that he took with him when he was going on excursions in the top right. Of course, he wrote letters, as seen on the bottom left, and he also made diagrams. Here is one of the geological cross-section of the Andes. I think writing is worth us spending a moment thinking about why a scientist should know how to do this in the proper manner for bringing material to the scientific community. Writing was a significant part of what the Beagle voyage required of Darwin, his observations, the organisms he saw, but he also wrote right from the very first day a private journal, a diary, we would call it today, a journal of the things he saw and thought, the places he visited, the dates that he was in different places. It was his record of this extraordinary event that had been so unexpected. And at the beginning, he imagined he would perhaps look back over his journal as an old man and remember those days. But as the voyage continued, he began thinking that this perhaps could be a publication. And he was thinking in this manner of the very famous personal narrative published by Alexander von Humboldt. And Darwin began to model his journal on Humboldt's personal narrative, and indeed published it later on, which I'll speak about in a moment. So writing was part of what he was meant to be doing on the Beagle voyage. And his style changed, his ambitions for writing changed as the voyage continued. He had also to record the material for future naturalists, for future work and an analysis by contemporaries. When he brought his collections back home, they had to be accompanied by written materials explaining where and when and how, and the habits of whatever it was that was the specimen. And of course, as I've already indicated, the writing through those 5 years of the voyage helped him. It served as a process of self-discovery and identity. Over those years, he realized he was not ideally suited to join the English church as had been proposed, and that what he really wanted to be was a scientific gentleman of the kind of like Charles Lyell, for example, whose book he was deeply engaged with, or a professor like his Cambridge University professor, John Stevens Henslow. He wanted to join the scientific community, and that emerges perhaps not through his writing per se, but through his thinking on the voyage and the way that he presented himself in his letters home, self-discovery and identity. And then more to the point perhaps of thinking about the voyage as part of a colonial endeavor, the person who writes the information down and brings it to the scientific community tends to be called the discoverer, and it obscures the many people who also know this information and have brought it to Darwin's attention. The by writing something down in his own notebooks, Darwin was in a way appropriating that information and turning it into a Western fact, a Western piece of information for science. And he was actually appropriating many of the places and spaces and people, the information that people had in his turning it into his own systematic inquiries. So I think writing is worth spending a little time on. Oh, I'm not going to go there. We'll leave that up for the moment. So a look at Darwin's early life reveals that naturally he wrote things down. We're very lucky as historians that much of that has been preserved. We wouldn't know it if we hadn't got it in an archive at the moment. In his school days, he wrote letters to his sisters and friends, and that was a habit that he expanded upon during his university days, first at Edinburgh University and then at Cambridge University in England in 1828 to 1831. At university at Cambridge, he became very friendly with his second cousin, William Darwin Fox, who was also at the university. And William Darwin Fox and Charles Darwin shared a very intense interest in natural history. And the letters they exchanged, both whilst they were at college and in the holidays and after the university, they shared a very cheerful intimacy, as if the two friends were sitting in a room together, despite the fact that they were separated because they were writing letters to each other. However, interesting as these early letters are, I think it was the Beagle Voyage that gave Darwin the impetus to construct a self beyond his immediate interests. He received the invitation in 1831, and it lasted for 5 years. He returned in October 1836, and it's a rather trite and obvious remark, but he was a changed man when he arrived. Historians now know a great deal about his time on board, his thoughts, his adventures, and his collecting activities from the wide range of material that he composed. And more specifically, I've already mentioned this in the slide that we're looking at now, the scientific records of the voyage can be considered part of the imperial project. Darwin was a white European male aiming to understand and collect materials from lands very foreign to him, and it could now be regarded as a form of intellectual bioprospecting. Writing and recording can lay claim to natural phenomena in much the same way as removing plants, rocks, or animals from a region does. Darwin's European eyes reinterpreted indigenous natural phenomena by repositioning them as facts. And his writings, just as much as his collection of natural objects, appropriated and synthesized local knowledge. It's quite interesting to me how the objects that Darwin collected have become reified in natural history collections and are classic topics for examination of Darwin's achievements on the Beagle Voyage. Few people ever think about the things that he noted in his records in his notebooks, his field notebooks, his catalogues, and his journal, as a part of that collecting process also. I think it's appropriate that we should recall that, think about that making facts out of a journey is as significant for science as bringing the objects back to whichever nation sent out a voyage. So Darwin's letters from the Beagle back to his friends, his family, and scientific colleagues that he had come to know, both through the voyage, through the fact that he was on a voyage, and through his old professors at Cambridge, his letters to these people reflect this reconstruction of natural history as an object of Western inquiry. And they show him learning to speak about himself as the originator of scientific ideas, mostly tentative at this point in time, but sufficiently novel to generate interest in what he was thinking by or from geologists, particularly in London. Darwin's old professor, who was not old in years, Darwin's previous professor from Cambridge, John Stevens Henslow, even circulated extracts from Darwin's letters long before he returned back from the Beagle voyage, long before 1836, and had them printed up as a pamphlet. So these letters that were written relatively informally to his former professor had sufficient novelty and rethinking of the material to suggest that other people, not just the professor, would be interested in what Darwin had to say, and they were printed and circulated at that time. Another thing that I think was important in developing the literary style that ultimately appears in the Origin was that when the Beagle returned to England, Darwin spent many months actively converting the journal into a narrative that was published in 1838 called Journal of Researches, closely modeled on Alexander von Humboldt's personal narrative, in the sense that Darwin wished to combine personal reflection with descriptions of the natural history, the places he visited, and the peoples he encountered. Darwin's book, the 1838 book, Journal of Researches, was highly successful and established his reputation as a talented traveling naturalist. And in it, it's well worth rereading this volume. In it, Darwin created himself, or described himself, as a thoughtful and adventurous young man who could describe landscapes and events in an attractive manner, just as he had spoken about these things in his letters home. The success of this volume encouraged the London publisher John Murray to agree to publish The Origin of Species, which was, of course, a very different book, as it turned out. And the success of Darwin's Journal of Researches also stimulated the proprietor of Mudie's circulating library to buy 500 copies of The Origin on the day of publication in order to send to his subscribing library members. It's very unusual. Mudie we have the record, Moody's records, he did not normally buy 500 copies of any book, but certainly a book such as The Origin of Species, which was really a very scientific book. It was the success of Darwin's previous publication, Journal of Researches, that stimulated Moody to buy those 500 copies. And it was that sale to Moody that bought out the number of copies that were available for booksellers. That's why the sale of The Origin was, so to speak, sold out on the day of publication. And again, the people who subscribed to Moody's and asked to have The Origin of Species sent to them were not expecting a book like that. They were expecting another book like the Journal of Researches. So it's quite interesting that this charming narrative of Darwin's voyage had a noticeable impact on the sales, on the acceptance by the publisher, and on the sales of The Origin of Species when it finally came out. This gave Darwin's book, The Origin, much wider circulation than might have been anticipated. So Darwin pursued his scientific research very widely through correspondence after he returned from the Beagle voyage. He had already become accustomed to writing very considerably about his work and his thoughts and his ideas while he was on the Beagle voyage, and he continued to correspond with people after the Beagle voyage and develop it as a technique for gathering information much more extensively, so that we now are very accustomed to talk about Darwin's correspondence network as a research methodology. Other scientists during this period similarly used correspondence as a way of gathering information. So Darwin was not unusual in this. It's very remarkable that we have many of these letters. There are some 15,000 letters in existence to and from Darwin in his lifetime, and approximately a third of these relate to Darwin's work gathering material for The Origin of Species. I want to just refer briefly to two theoretical pieces of writing, two pieces of writing about evolution by natural selection that Darwin composed in between this point of returning from the Beagle voyage. Of course, he wrote his theoretical notebooks, which I'm not going to dwell on, but he also, in due course, wrote preliminary sketches of his theory that I wish to turn to now. In 1842, he felt ready to write a short sketch of the theory of evolution by natural selection. He had called it descent with modification, or actually here he calls it species theory. This is the cover page on the left of this sketch of his species theory, written in May and June 1842. And it was first written in pencil, and he then wrote a cover in ink, but the pencil page from the pencil sketch is on the right, a page from the conclusion in which he says, "Such are my reasons for believing that specific forms are not immutable." So he had brought his gathering of information and his theoretical contemplation of this concept to such a point that he felt he could write it And this is my point in showing it to you, is that his thoughts had got to a place where he could write it as an essay, or as he calls it, a sketch. It was very private. It was very elliptical. You can see from the little extract how much he was adding and crossing out and changing as he was going. So I would like to propose that to write in this particular instance was for Darwin to think. And then 2 years later, in 1844, he expanded it into a fully articulated essay. And from several clues in his correspondence, it appears that he deliberately wrote this essay for an audience, for scientific people to read. He didn't envisage publishing it right away, for he was cautious. He was a strategist. He was often uneasy about his proposals and always attempting to gauge the responses that he might get, particularly through letters. Moreover, given his work on the topic, he felt in 1844 that he needed to do a great deal more research to make the theory hold water. And we know a lot of this because of the letter that he wrote to his wife, Emma, my dear Emma, dated the 5th of July, 1844, telling her he's just finished the sketch of my species theory. This was a letter that we assume was only meant to be read in the event of his death or his severe illness, at which point he could hope that this essay might be published. There's been a lot of work about, a lot of thought given to the problem of whether Darwin ever meant it to be published. Is it also possible that he may have wished to die before it was published? So there's plenty we can read into this letter to his wife, but on the surface of it, he simply asks his wife to keep the essay to hand, that should he become ill or die, she would be given money in his will to publish it, and Darwin lists 6 or 7 individuals who he would like, 6 or 7 scientific men who he would like to serve as editor. So he took very considerable precautions about making sure that this would be available for science, for scientific people. The style suggests this. And here it is. It's got a table of contents that you can see in this extract here. There's part 1, there's part 2. It's written into chapters. And Darwin went to the trouble of paying somebody to copy it out in good handwriting, so that he actually had 2 copies, the draft, the original, like this, and a fair copy. It's important, isn't it, to look at this letter and see how his convictions had consolidated about the work. He personally believed that the theory of evolution by natural selection was valid. In the Origin of Species, he makes that plain as well, but he allows for the reader to have doubt. Here he says to Emma, his wife, who knew much about his work, I believe that my theory is true. It will be a considerable step in science. So my time is running out, and I won't talk in it at all about the events that led up to publication of the Origin of Species. They're well known, and I won't go through them here. But I wanted to ask, and here I will stop sharing, I wanted to conclude by asking, what can this discussion of Darwin as a writer tell us? Well, I think it shows that certainly for Darwin, and perhaps for many of us listening today, to write something down was to think it through. To write was to think. And in a larger historical sense, the practice of recording can be as significant in scientific activity as thinking, collecting, and experimenting. Without a record, without a written record, there can be no science. So I think, I hope that I've helped us come to see that science can only move forward if practitioners communicate and exchange their views, either through letters, conversation, reading material out loud at learning societies, or circulating their ideas in printed material. Communication is essential for science. And in Darwin's day, communication via correspondence was as essential as print publication for placing new views into the community. So I am proposing that communication via correspondence and print is an essential part of the history of how science changes and develops. And furthermore, where I've mostly emphasized today's discussion, Darwin used writing to develop, to find his personality. He clearly thought that one day he would publish his views, less so perhaps on the Beagle voyage, although coming to that conclusion by the time the voyage finished, and of course unclear about whether he was going to publish his views on evolution in between the Beagle voyage and what eventually became The Origin of Species. He was reluctant to publish until he was completely certain of his evidence and the response. But by the time he came to write The Origin of Species, he was comfortable with a certain style of expression, a form of writing that had served him well on the Beagle voyage as a way of conveying his adventures and his insights, and then subsequently as a way of presenting a published narrative about the voyage in which he, like Humboldt, was the central point of reference. The Journal of Researches was also written in the first person, like Humboldt's narrative. So it seems very possible that Darwin transferred this style into The Origin of Species, perhaps not even deliberately thinking that this would serve as a persuasive device, but it certainly became such as the book, when the book was published. And so I've argued that this personalized literary form of writing was one factor, a significant factor, among the many that contributed to the vigor and the lasting power of his argument in the book that we're celebrating today on the origin of species. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you. Thank you. It was very enlightening. We have questions in our chat. Can you see the chat?
Okay.
There are 3 questions. One from Joel Vargas, Etzali Esquivel, and Hugo Emilio Martinez.
Oh, Joel, thank you for your question. I think you're absolutely right. I did not stress sufficiently that, of course, the knowledge that people had in the various countries, of course, South America particularly, that Darwin traveled over. Of course, there were other people who had written things. It's not just Darwin who makes the first record of anything. And we are now coming to recognize much more fully that the process of producing knowledge, in this particular instance, in Darwin's case, is one that obscures the other people who already had written and knew about local phenomena. And that was what I was hoping, that was the point I was hoping to make, but I obviously didn't quite make it, that of course there were many figures who were, for a very long time, who had knowledge of the phenomena, the natural phenomena of the places that Darwin visited. Sometimes he was lucky enough to meet some of these people, and sometimes they were gracious enough to tell him things. Many times he was, as it were, rethinking it, thinking it all anew and turning what he saw into Western or Europeanized information, thereby turning it into something that European science could use. So I would not wish our listeners today to think that I was not acknowledging the people who also knew things when Darwin was traveling.
Thank you. There is another one from Etzali Esquivel. Could this act of writing as such be an activity subject to study in the history and sociology of science? And if so, how could this be done?
Well, it would need someone like yourself to make this a study. We are thinking much more about the way material is presented. I would so much like to see new and exciting historical accounts of course, Darwin and other people who have used words as persuasive parts of their science. Everyone that we study in the history of science clearly uses words. They have to use words. But in the way individuals now, historians are thinking much more about the effect of visualization, how persuasive visualization can be. I would like it very much if scholars began to think more about the style of writing, also as a persuasive device. If Darwin's book was published today, it would perhaps be thought of as almost journalistic because there's no footnotes. There's it's very conversational. He's very persuasive. So that I think we might begin to look, and I'm sure people are already doing it, begin to look at these questions of style through the medium of what used to be called popular science, through writing for a general audience, a non-scientific audience. We can learn a lot from the style that is used in those kinds of works. So I would suggest maybe you could make a try at this. It would be very nice to see more studies about style.
Thank you. There's another one. It's a long one. Do you want to read it?
Shall I read it? Has everyone access to the chat, or shall I read it?
No, you read it, because yes. Only
okay. So, Amelia Ugo asks that there are critiques about Darwin's theories, that perhaps they were not so very original after all, and that others had already come to them by their own. and that Darwin was the one to bring them to the public. So there's two thoughts here, which is absolutely correct, that Darwin was not the first. There were other people who had spoken for 100 years, although not many, but some people for 100 years had suggested that organisms have the ability to change. They mostly suggested that the organisms had the ability to change using their own bodies to do that, a kind of self-propelling change, Lamarck being the most famous among these. So evolution, change, and non-divine origins were certainly spoken about long before Darwin. Darwin, in his own day, was not the only one to propose the exact same theory, because I did not mention Alfred Russel Wallace, who came up with the same idea of competition, selection, and statistically relevant death that allowed new forms to consolidate in a population. So Darwin was not alone, even in his own time, and that Wallace absolutely simultaneously discovered the same concepts. After Darwin published, there were a number of individuals who said, you're not the first to do this, because I or someone else had also thought of natural selection. And so there was somebody called, I'm going to forget his name now, but there were a number of people who, Patrick Matthew is the person I'm thinking of, had very clearly spelled out in a published book the principle of natural selection. So it's important for us as scholars to recognize that Darwin was not alone. And what was so interesting for historians is to speak and consider the problem about, if Darwin was not alone, why has he become the one that everybody talks about? And here we have to say thank you to Professor Browne, because it was surely the origin of species that brought Darwin into the public eye in quite such an astonishing way. So this is a long way around answering your question. Was Darwin, in his writings, primarily trying to convince Lyell, his friend Lyell, but also his mentor Lyell, the geologist, whose point of view had done so much to help Darwin construct his own scientific point of view? I'm sure that much of what Darwin was trying to do in his preliminary essays, the sketch I showed you, the essay I showed you, the letters that he exchanged with Lyell, you're right. Yes, he's trying to convince Lyell. By the time he got to write The Origin of Species, his sense of his potential audience had widened, and he was writing for Lyell. He was writing for his friend Joseph Hooker. He was writing for his cousin William Darwin Fox. He was writing for Alfred Russel Wallace. He was trying to explain himself in a satisfactory way. All these people he already knew, and a number of other people who he admired. Humboldt, I think, was not alive at that point, but Darwin certainly admired very greatly the philosopher John Herschel, William Whewell, a Cambridge professor, many people in the sciences that he was writing for. Perhaps I can add, in conclusion, that Darwin was rather surprised that so many people who were not scientists had read his book. He was surprised. He had not expected that. And part of that wide circulation was surely to do with the distribution through Moody's circulating library. It was partly to do with the controversies and debates that were published in the general periodicals of the day that brought Darwin's name to the fore and created an atmosphere in which lots of people wanted to know what was being said in this book. So I think in both regards in your question, you are correct. And I would like just to expand a little bit on the second half of your question, is that he was certainly trying to convince Lyle, but he was trying to convince other people as well. Okay. Thank you. It's a good question. And here we have someone else down here at the bottom asking about population genetics. So I'm not sure if I have much to say about population genetics at the moment, but how interesting it all is that I don't know about current biologists. They all believe in evolution by natural selection, apart from those who are more convinced about epigenetics. It's hard now to move away from selection theory. Possibly we are doing that at the moment. It would be quite interesting if we were. But, you know, Darwin's theories were very 19th century theories, and they have lasted in the most part because so many other scientific achievements have shown that they have value. So without genetics, we would not be talking in this way about the origin of species. Without the achievements of the 1940s in evolutionary biology, where they crafted classic Darwinism into the new synthesis, we couldn't be speaking in this way. We would be thinking of The Origin of Species as an interesting book in its time, but not one that continues to have an impact. But it does still have an impact as long as one can get through some of the miscellaneous information that now we can't quite understand in the same way as Darwin did.
Well, I think there's no more questions, Professor Browne. See, no more questions. So we were very happy to have you here. And thank you again in the name of the Seminario Universitario de Historia, Filosofía y Estudios de la Ciencia y la Medicina. I really appreciate your willingness to be here with us today. And your conference was just lovely. Thank you very much.
I'm very grateful to have participated, and I wish to thank you and my audience. How very gracious of you to attend. So we wish to celebrate Darwin's origin. Thank you.
Yes, that's the point.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay.
Muchas gracias, decía yo, a la doctora Janet Browne. Muchas gracias por su presencia, por sus preguntas, y les recordamos que mañana tenemos al profesor James Secord hablando sobre el mismo tema de la celebración de la publicación.